Good afternoon. Today I will be discussing 19th century subversions of Victorian sexuality through esoteric interventions. Specifically, I'll be examining sex magic on the one hand and queer semiotics within Anglo-Catholicism on the other. In order to do this, I will first examine the link between Western esotericism and gender studies, go over some terminology, give a brief contextualization of sexuality in the Victorian era. I will discuss the systems of sex magic of Pascal, Beverly Randolph, and then briefly Aleister Crowley, as well as expressions of same-sex desire in Anglo-Catholic ritual and practice. I will give an overview of these esoteric subversions and then have room for questions. So as we learned yesterday, religionism ignores the external generally, positing inherent universal truths. And I see a lot of similarities between the polemical debates of religionism and historicism in Western esotericism and a central polemical issue in the field of gender studies. In that, similar to religionism, we have gender essentialism. And essentialism is the foundation of the gender binary. It essentially posits categories man and woman and asserts that each has an inherent essence. The essence both assigns and juxtaposes femininity and masculinity as a natural truth. Essentialist thought is also the basis of gendered stratification or gender roles, the likes of which are observed in the Victorian era. Historicism, on the other hand, takes into account externalities. The field of gender studies utilizes a deconstructivist cultural theory model of study, which I believe to be compatible with the historicism utilized in the contemporary study of Western esotericism. I also see a multitude of interdisciplinary and intersectional potentialities of scholarship between these two fields. The intersections of Western esotericism and gender studies provides expansive potentials for continuous developmental thinking and a recontextualization of both fields. So my research for this paper aims to explore the means in which esoteric movements can influence, liberate, and transform societal constructs of sexuality and gender. So before I begin, I do feel it is important to go over some terminology. So essentially, when I say queer, I mean anything that actively disrupts normativity, transgresses boundaries, and interferes with the status quo in a closed and sexual system. Basically, whatever normative is, queerness exists in juxtaposition to that. Then we have transgression. Transgression is defined as not simply hedonism or unrestrained sexual license. Rather, its power lies in the dialectic or play between taboo, which are social rules, and transgression, through which one can systematically construct and then overstep. And then lastly, we have coding. Coding can be defined as semiotics, intended for both identification and invisibility within the larger culture, as well as communication among themselves, and what is meant here by themselves is the othered group that is engaging in said coding. A modern example of all three of these principles coming together can be observed in 1970s queer male culture in the US. So here we see that different accessories and the placement of these accessories on the body are actually loaded with hidden codes that simultaneously signal queerness, sexual positionality, and even the specifics of sex acts or kinks. Coding, therefore, provides a means for other groups to charge and embed common objects with messages of eroticism that are hidden from the assimilated masses. We will return to coding later, and now briefly, or actually primarily, jump into the 19th century. So just to contextualize sexuality during the Victorian era, this was the era in which the Psychopathia Sexualis was published. In this kind of medical manuscript, homosexuality became an identity rather than just a sex act, and healthy versus pathological forms of sex were established. We also have the gendered spheres of existence that we can witness in the Victorian era, specifically the public versus private, thanks in part to industrialization, and the cult of domesticity, which posits that a woman's place is in the home. We also have men as viewed as sexual beings with sexual needs, and women basically rendered asexual. So now we get into sex magicians, starting with Pascal Beverly Randolph, who was a medium and scryer and a curer of sexual dysfunction, but also a very politically active figure both before and during the American Civil War era. He was a founder of the National Equal Rights League and a delegate in the National Convention of Colored Men, and also a defender of women's rights. So Randolph developed his system of sex magic, which he calls affectional alchemy. He used this system was part of his vision for a greater utopian world. In this system, the participants can achieve earthly manifestations such as money, or divine goals such as knowledge and gnosis. And he is actually pretty scientific in his approach to sex magic, in that he discusses sex magic in terms of positive and negative energies. We have the male energy, which is positive on the physical plane, and the female energy, which is positive on the mental plane. And when these two energies come together, the participants can harness the body's electrical forces in order to manifest. Both partners have an active role in this system, and the moment of joint orgasm is when the ultimate spiritual power is made available. Interestingly, during an era in which women were rendered as having no sexual desires or feelings or capacity, Pascal Beverly Randolph was advocating female orgasm and kind of carving a space for female sexuality in his system of sex magic, in which he lists over 100 uses for this. It does have its requirements, however. It must be heterosexual and performed between a married couple. So here we can see the Victorian era social standards interwoven into Randolph's sex magic system. Additionally, it is worth noting that even though he was an advocate for women's rights and acknowledged the existence of the female sex drive, he still had pretty essentialistic views of gender, in that he viewed women as complementary to men. Also, he warned that misuse of his sex magic system would have negative spiritual and psychological consequences. The misuse, of course, would be categorized as homosexuality, masturbation, excessive heterosexual sex, and sex outside of marriage. So an encapsulation of all of these sexual transgressions and more can be seen in Aleister Crowley. Crowley's sex magic was different from Randolph's in that he was not trying to defy a sexual taboo or society, but he was trying to defile it. And these deliberate violations of social and sexual taboos is where the power in his sex magic came from. The more vile the sex act and the more vile the partner, the more transgressive and potentially transcendent the magic was. Homosexual acts were included in some of the highest stages of his sex rituals, and one scholar, Bradford Verder, actually called Crowley's sex magic a queering of the occult. However, even though Crowley's desire to overthrow the repressive Victorian Christian society and his desire to transgress Victorian beliefs, he was still actually an active participant of them, I would argue. For instance, Crowley viewed women as somewhat expendable, They could be a shrine for God, yet not God themselves, since they lacked the penis and semen. This kind of gendered essentialism and misogyny is actually quite in line with Victorian discourses on sexuality and gender. While sex magic systems overtly discuss sexuality, I would now like to turn to a more hidden, artistic, and ritualistic side of sexual expression. Sex magic appears to subvert or even dissent religion, but this esoteric intervention of the 19th century confines confines of sex and gender can be observed in Anglo-Catholicism. Suffering and shame associated with sexuality intensifies within marginalized sexualities due to the inability in Victorian culture to access an outlet for these desires. This created what scholar Dominic James refers to as queer martyrdom, or the concept that sexual liberation can be accessed through shame and suffering. Through obedience, self-discipline, service to others, Victorian priests could purify their sexual desires, utilize sexual deviancies for salvation, and express same-sex desire in a coded and devotional manner. I have included here a pre-Raphaelite painting, The Merciful Night, by Edward Burne-Jones. The pre-Raphaelites were subversive and rebellious through their art, for instance, in the ways they painted and portrayed women or same-sex desire. This image, I believe, is a good representation of erotic themes within religious imagery and returns us to the theme of coding. For instance, you can see the knight's sword unsheathed and splayed out in tandem with his intimate embrace of Christ, who is penetrated actively during this embrace by the nail at his feet. These could potentially contain suggestions of the erotic. Furthermore, both men appear somewhat frail, which evokes Victorian notions of effeminacy. And to queer this painting even more, if we really wanted to look for queer semiotics here, it isn't beyond the realm of possibility that the marigolds underneath the raised surface, also known as a flower of the sun, may not just be a flower of the celestial sun, but perhaps the Son of Christ, or of God as in Jesus. And this could perhaps suggest a sexual positionality of the sun in this painting. The public reception of this image was not well received, yet this painting was toned down from one of its initial sketches, such as this one that shows an even more intimate embrace and a kiss between the figure and Christ. But here, importantly, we see the addition of a church altar. And the desire for material, physical encounters with Christ is foundational to the practices of ritualist Anglo-Catholic priests during this era, such as William Bennett, who I will discuss. As showcased in his sermon on the Holy Name, William Bennett says, "As we behold him under the sacred veils, so he beholds us. As we stretch forth our hands to him, so he is stretched forth to us." So William Bennett was a ritualist Anglo-Catholic priest in Frome, England, and he advocated the doctrine of the real presence. This was already a controversial doctrine for the time, yet Bennett took it a step further. He did not only believe that Christ was present during the Mass, but that Christ was visible. And he really emphasized the visualizations of Christ and Christ's body as the ideal male body for the priest to gaze upon, as well as the parishioners. For Bennett, Mass was not about listening to a priest give a sermon, but rather a site in which to have a bodily encounter with Christ. Furthermore, for purification and salvation during Mass, the purification of the soul comes from Christ's blood, and the purification of the body from Christ's body. Here are some quotes I have pulled from some of Bennett's sermons, letters, or pamphlets that I think really showcase his, I would say, erotic longings for Christ's body. For instance, the body and blood of our blessed Lord, his humanity combined with his divinity, are to be worshipped. Or the second quote, our sinful bodies may be made clean by his body, and our souls washed through his most precious blood, that our sinful bodies may be made clean by his body. Here are two bodies put together. Observe not the soul, the mind, or any other spiritual part which may be about us, but the body. And lastly, when with Christ you have suffered a while, you may be with him perfected. Receiving him in his most precious body and blood from this altar, may you with him ascend in his glory. In his 1867 letter, A Plea for Toleration in the Church of England, Bennett described a literal and sensuous encounter with Christ, in which Mass was a conduit. And he also emphasized the visual appearance of Christ as an ideal man. This letter is what eventually got him sued by a fellow parishioner, or one of his parishioners rather, this trial being bankrolled by the Conservative Church Association. He was charged with making heretical statements about the Eucharist, and even though he was condemned by the judge for this behavior, he was eventually acquitted of these charges on account that he begrudgingly changed his language about the visibility of Christ during Mass in the 3rd edition of this pamphlet. Those who are tempted or were tempted by same-sex desires may have been drawn to either lead such religious practices or attend such masses. And in this way, Dominic Janes supposes that Anglo-Catholicism could have actually acted as a site of cultural queerness, with queer codes embedded within ritual practices and artistic depictions. Through these coded expressions of desire, such as ritualist priest William Bennett's emphasis on Christ as the ideal body, or the undertones of sexualization with descriptions of encounters with Christ, queer coding intersected with hidden truths and secret desires. And in this Anglo-Catholic space, queerness became esoteric. So as we have seen, esoteric interventions were utilized in the 19th century as liberatory subversive means. In the Affectional Alchemy of P.B. Randolph, he was subverting biopolitics and the idea that the only acceptable form of sexuality between a married couple was to birth children. Randolph also carved a space for female sexual desire, participation, and liberation within sexuality. In this Sex Magic of Aleister Crowley, social taboo or rules were intentionally attacked, and sexual deviancies of the time, such as homosexuality or masturbation, sex outside of marriage, were made intentionally and offensively visible. And then within the practice of Anglo-Catholic ritualist priests, we see expressions of same-sex desires through semiotics and ritual. We see sexual deviancy, sin, and shame being inverted and actually being used as erotic acts of devotion and salvation. Not only could queer priests engage with same-sex desires in a coded way, but they could also gain salvation from their deviant desires through aesthetic discipline and devotion to Christ. We also see a urge or intense desire to have contact with the actual body and blood of Christ, and this desire as being salvational and purifying. These material encounters with Christ's body and blood through ritualistic masses were enthusiastic and devotional visualizations of Christ's body among a community of men whose sexualities were already queered either through covert same-sex desires or by the virtue of abstaining from heterosexual marriage, and a safe and hidden outlet for sexuality to be discursively expressed was in existence here. So essentially, to conclude, gender roles and social standards of sexual behavior were challenged in this era through esoteric means. From sex magic to same-sex religious imagery, the esoteric was a site for sexual rebellion, subversion, and play within 19th century gender and concepts of sexuality. the esoteric here influenced, liberated, and transformed constructs of gender and sexuality. And ultimately, the intersections of Western esotericism and gender and sexuality studies provides expansive potentials for scholarship. Lastly, I would of course be remiss if I did not address the fact that my examination of 19th century subversions of gender and sexuality did not contain any women or feminist movements during this time. So for those interested in more feminist scholarship on the esoteric, specifically in this era, I would highly recommend Alex Owen's The Darkened Room, Per Faxneld's Satanic Feminism, and Manon Hedenborg-White's The Eloquent Blood, The Goddess Babylon, and the Construction of Femininities in Western Esotericism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, as I expected, it's an excellent way to go into the lunch because we have a lot to think about. I was fascinated by the Burne Jones. That's really great. I mean, that likely will work out good. Okay. Room for questions. Sure. Go. Yeah.
What do you think that this kind of topic or this kind of area of study, what great contribution could it give to the study of Western esotericism, but also at like a larger scale culturally?
That's a good question. I'll try to not take up the... Yeah, I mean, I do find value in, specifically in the aspect of semiotics and coding, of kind of taking avenues of studying the esoteric through a lens of gender and sexuality to kind of, for me, find these hidden and covert queer histories and queer sexualities that were certainly overlooked during the time and are even being overlooked now. And so, especially culturally, I thank you for including that. I think it has a lot of value in scholarship, but also culturally of unearthing these hidden histories and narratives and figures and characters using kind of a queered or othered field of Western esotericism, interdisciplinarily with other fields to kind of, yes, unearth these overlooked histories.
Yeah, if I remember the instructions for Randall's sex magic correctly, I think a key point was that at the moment of orgasm, you sort of had to make an intent and then it would manifest.
That's the most potent moment. So, but joint orgasm is when it is the strongest because both sex fluids contain their own magic.
Right.
Because of the different energies of positive and negative that he kind of posits. And so if you're orgasming and you're having your intention, that's, you know, one thing, but if there's a joint orgasm with both of these energies coming together in union with the two bodies in union, that's when, you know.
But who makes the intent? Like, can you have a simultaneous orgasm? And do you also both make the same intent? Like, do you agree beforehand? Or is it more like, well, you should, you know, have the simultaneous orgasm, but it's okay if just the man makes the intent?
That's a good question. No, you actually don't have to make the same intent. And I think in some of Randolph's reasons for sex magic, one of them was kind of maintaining your partner's sexual attraction to you, which might not be something you necessarily want to tell your partner that you're going to manifest while orgasming, or for wives to be able to kind of have control over their husbands. So there was a level of covert kind of birthing of secret or individual desires and wishes, but I do assume that there could be joint intentions too, specifically sex magic used during a pregnancy to supercharge the fetus, as it were. I would assume that both.
But where is instructions circulated among women?
I'm not sure if women themselves, that's a really good question, if women themselves were, this is independently and solely kind of accessing
Yeah.
this. I know that Randolph reached out to a lot of women and drew in a lot of women, and obviously he and his wife were practicing this, but I'm not sure, is your question like if there was if his sex magic was like advertised
is it
to
like
women?
is it
and-
like a men's thing that men are saying to each other, did you know that if you make
Oh.
an intent at this moment in time it happens?
Mhm.
And it's our little secret, or are women aware of this and they're also making intents? You know, like
In the way that Randolph wrote about sex magic, he made it seem as though women had agency to make their own intentions, which would lead me to believe that women were also kind of in the know of this
right.
system, and not just.
Yeah.
I think that would be a little bit more like a Crowleyan
Yeah.
kind of like using the body as a means of manifestation without fully disclosing. But yeah, just that answers.
Yeah, hi. I just want to say thank you for that so much. I really enjoyed it. I really like your point about like turn of the century sexual magic in the style of Randolph as a form of subversion of biopolitics.
Mm.
And I think that can be applied very, very strongly to Crowley as well. Then on a technical point with the homosexual rituals in Crowley's system, I assume that you're thinking about the 11th degree ritual of Vertio.
Yes.
Yes, which is conventionally assumed to be a ritual of anal sex, which is, of course, not necessarily homosexual, though he did perform it with men because he was bisexual. So,
Right.
but there's also a lot of really interesting things to look at there in terms of kind of queer dynamics in Crowley's relationships with women as well. One of the most obvious examples is that he had this feminine persona of Alice that he sometimes took on, and he took on that as well at certain points with his female lovers, and he's sort of describing that as kind of a lesbian experience, which is really funny and interesting as well. And then kind of piggybacking off of Ninian's comment or question about sort of the value of engaging with gender and queer studies and the study of esotericism and vice versa. I think there's, I mean, obviously given what I do as well, I think there's tremendous potential in that. And one of the things is really, I think this is important to understanding esoteric movements and esoteric ideas, because sometimes, not in every case, but in some cases, these ideas about gender, they're not just like tangential or peripheral, they're actually central and formative to what these movements are about. And we see that with Crowley and with Randolph very strongly as well, because they were both in different ways trying to sort of challenge dominant attitudes in society about gender and sexuality. And this idea of the formulation of intent in the performance of sexual magic. So Crowley very strongly says that it's the man who formulates the intent, because he has the semen, which is the active component of a ritual. And that is, of course, something that's been, if we look at the emic esoteric literature, very sort of strongly challenged over the course of the 20th century, going back to people like Kenneth Grant in the 1970s, who writes his Typhonian trilogies, where a really fundamental idea is that Crowley is wrong about the sexual magic, and it's actually the woman's sexual fluids that are like the catalyst for everything happening. And then lots of kind of feminist or sort of feminist-inspired esoteric writers within the genre of sexual magic who have sort of pushed that idea as well, or at least challenged the idea that the intent comes exclusively from the man. So in that case, these ideas, they're not like, I mean, sometimes they're at the center, actually, of kind of renegotiating these ideas about magical practice and how it works. And from the other side, I think esotericism studies has a tremendous amount to contribute to just the study of the development of ideas about gender and sexuality in society, as well as we see with spiritualism or theosophy. Those were really important to first wave feminism, and we see parallels to that as well today with feminist and queer advocates engaging with magical ideas. So, sorry.
No, love
I
that.
just gave my own paper.
Crowley as a lesbian, that's a new insight. Okay, go ahead.
I love that. That's great.
Go ahead. Anything you want?
Yeah, I was going to say I'm very interested also in the modern kind of queer the intersectionalities with queerness and witchcraft as a political tool, but also a queer spirituality of an identity that isn't welcome in a lot of other spiritualities, and kind of like the resurgence and the researching for the esoteric. Interesting. But the first wave feminist bit is super interesting with the spiritualism. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, not so much a question, but unfortunately I cannot attend the next two presentations, so I'd like to take the opportunity to express my gratitude. I find it highly fascinating. Thank you for organizing and great presentations. Thank you so much. Is it going to be another mini conference?
We do something like this every year.
Every year.
At the same time, although the program Western Esotericism is changing, it's going to change next year, so I'm not sure how that will work out next year. Whether it will still have the same theme or whether we'll do it, it's not clear yet. So you have to stay close. I just like to say that I find that I'm getting introduced lately to this notion of the connection, the possible connection to esotericism and gender studies and so on. It's not something I've worked on, but I mean, from my perspective, there's a kind of automatic, intuitive connection between my understanding of rejected knowledge and what you call queer studies, etc. I mean, there's some kind of intuitive, automatic connection. This is rejected, right? And so that leads to many interesting questions. So I'm really looking forward to see what you're up to, what you're going to do. All right. So thanks a lot for your presence. We are a bit late, which is fine. We're going to reconvene originally at